Okay, everyone, welcome. Big welcome, special welcome to Glen as well. It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Glen O'Hara from Oxford Brookes University. Glen will be talking to us today about his latest book, New Labour, New Britain, How the Blair Government's Reshaped the Country. It's great to welcome Glen. On a personal level, Glen was always very kind to me at Brookes, and I think Glen was actually on the appointment panel, which got me my start in academia. So in some ways, it's all Glen's fault to students and colleagues. But Glen's a fantastic historian, and it's great for him to come and speak to us about his new book. And I should also say this is also part of the work of the Contemporary History and Politics Research Group. And it's great to have Glen be our big speaker for the year. So, Glen, opportunity knocks. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, after that big build-up, I'm afraid for disappointment. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for the invite to both York St John University and to York University. And hello to you, hello to guests and also to colleagues from both universities. I'm going to be talking today, not for very long, you'll be pleased to hear, partly because my voice is extremely croaky. Now, the reason for that is that I actually went to Arsenal-Chelsea on Sunday night, and I spent the last 10 minutes shouting at my own team to get out of the box and stop dropping back too much. So I haven't got a huge amount of voice, but what amount of voice I've got is that I'm going to talk about the Blair years, which look these days to be kind of halcyon days of plenty and growth and of optimism compared to some of the way we feel today. Roy Jenkins said, you find people in their lives in characteristic forms, and my characteristic form was bellowing at Arsenal's back four on Sunday night. So that's the way. That's just the course of life. Well, also in the course of my life was a very sunny and a very spring-like May morning in 1997, on which the first Labour government for 18 years, and one of the very few Labour governments ever to win a general election, outright of course, was voted in by the British people on what seems now like an absolutely huge vote share of 44%. And of course, Keir Starmer wins a landslide on 10 points lower, 34% decades later. There was, I think, in the country a sense of palpable optimism, even, dare I say it, although it's alien to my own Eeyorish nature, a sense of hope which witnessed people, and I can attest to this because I saw it myself, even British people who were strangers talk to each other in the street. And on one occasion I could see, walking home after watching the general election coverage, people embrace each other in the street, which it seems to be extremely unusual for people who are reserved and don't want to speak to each other on the tube. So there was a hope that there was something new, something in the air. There were a set of new ideas, and there was a new, very youthful leader who was going to be Prime Minister, who had seemed in the mid-1990s to come almost from nowhere and to represent a new generation that had been born after the Second World War, not before the Second World War or after it. And it's worth reflecting on just how huge a victory this was. The Labour Party has only come from opposition into government with a majority that would stand the test of time in an entire parliament 3 times in all of its history. And in 1964, when it did it, its majority was only 3, so it wasn't going to last for very long. Only in 1997 and latterly in 2024 does the Labour Party win at all. And it's even led one of my colleagues, Richard Toy at Exeter, to joke about the nature of the Labour Party, which is the Labour Party aims to lose general elections and sometimes unfortunately ends up in government having not succeeded in throwing away its polling advantage in the lead up to government, when it would much rather have form a circular firing squad around itself and have its own civil war going on in opposition. Well, this was one of the very, very rare times when Labour was obsessed with winning, and it did win. And it won almost everywhere. It won in the south, where it only had 2 or 3 seats in the 1980s. It wins in the central industrial belt, ex-industrial belt of Scotland and northern England. And indeed, I think one of the underwritten stories and important stories of this period is that actually what Blair would have thought of as part of a progressive alliance, quote unquote, the Liberal Democrats break through and win 47 seats, become the biggest Liberal or Liberal Democrat group since the 1920s. and they would have formed, had Blair only had a small electoral majority, probably part of a wider coalition that would have been a phalanx to his right in that period, although it turns out to his left. They gain a huge amount of votes. They gain a number of vast swings, 14 and 15% in suburban England, in places like Crosby, where Shirley Williams had famously won that by-election for the SDP in the early 80s. And they win in their heartlands with huge votes that you could weigh very differently to the way in which a lot of the time later in the Blair era and in the 2010s, their votes kind of dribble away in those traditional heartlands in, for instance, the northeast of England. So this was a victory everywhere. It was a victory beyond even Labour's dreams in 1997, and it was a victory flanked by other forces, for instance, Welsh and Scottish nationalists, who for now were content to push for devolution rather than independence, and also for Liberal Democrats. Blair had succeeded in making Labour unscary, and he had succeeded in dragging with him many people who were very surprised to find themselves as Labour MPs, and then had to go and explain to their boss why they couldn't come back to work the next day. Well, nothing lasts forever, and although it was lovely to be young in that dawn of May 1997, all political careers, Enoch Powell famously said, end in failure. Well, I don't think they do end in failure, and I think that's quite a nihilistic thing to say, because, as I'm going to go on to say today, Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, did many things domestically that were entirely creditable and made people's lives enormously better. But Blair's popularity drains away, first slowly and then very quickly. And the word that will always be hung around Blair's neck, and the word that will always be replied to you in talking about the Blair era, justifiably I think, is Iraq. Of course, Blair joins in what was seen by many people on the left in Britain as an imperialist adventure in the Middle East against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in a second Gulf War, a second Middle Eastern war of the era, which turns into not just a failed policy aim, which was to discover weapons of mass destruction, apparently, but also a disastrous and catastrophic sectarian civil war in Iraq, which probably cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Some of you may have seen Blair discuss this in the recent Channel 4 documentary, and he discusses it, and they discuss it with much more precision and alacrity than I can, because both of I've written a domestic history of New Labour, and that's my expertise. And we hope that there will be many other volumes that will not be as cowardly as I've been and simply write about domestic politics, which are slightly less controversial and slightly less likely to get you heckled. But I think Blair's authority would have drained away, as do all political authorities in some ways anyway, because one is always bound to disappoint the high hopes put in you. But then your stock, your credit, your numbers then slowly and strangely sometimes begin to rise again. It's no accident that Harold Wilson's numbers, who had been excoriated from left and right in the 1970s, rose throughout the 1990s. And I think the numbers of David Cameron, whose premiership of course ends disastrously in the Brexit referendum, and even of Theresa May and Boris Johnson, will have revisionist historians, perhaps 20 or 30 years from now, saying that there were policy wins, there were gains, there were successes. People will talk about gay marriage in the Cameron era. People will talk about getting first to the COVID vaccine in the Johnson era, perhaps with some justification. In terms of Tony Blair, although he remains relatively unpopular at the last time we looked, about -25, that is not as unpopular as he once was. So this process of his numbers rebounding or slowly bubbling up once again from deep, deep unpopularity has perhaps already begun. There are lots of reasons for that which we don't have time to go into. One of them perhaps being that what Tony Blair said about Brexit became a kind of flag to gather round for Remainers, and when Remainers began to feel like one of the political tribes, Remainers looked to Blair, and what Blair had said about Brexit seemed to be coming true at every stage of the Brexit process. So there were plenty of Remain voters, liberally minded voters, outward-looking voters, who began to say, well, maybe you didn't like this about Blair, you didn't like his rhetoric on immigration sometimes, or you didn't like his foreign policy, or you didn't like his support for Israel in Lebanon. On the other hand, well, maybe he had a point about the great guiding issue of the 2010s. So his reputation, although low, has begun to recover. His numbers are far better than Keir Starmer's, although of course he's not in office, so he doesn't have to say unpopular things every day. And they're about the same, probably a little bit better than Kemi Badenoch's as leader of the opposition, which is rather a worse sign for her because she's not in office. But it's difficult, I think, to cast our mind back to the fact that Tony Blair was extraordinarily popular, vastly popular, strangely popular for many, many years, even while in office. So all we've got here is a chart of 3 governments and their lead over opposition parties. Conservative government in the 50s and 60s, Conservative government under Thatcher and Major, and then in bold, the Labour government. Well, the Labour government's lead over the Conservative opposition is far larger than the Conservatives' lead over Labour in the 50s or the 80s, and it goes on being so way, way, way into Blair's tenure as Prime Minister, until about 70 or 80 months in. So about, what's that, about 5 or 6 years, 7 years in, about the time of course, the Iraq War and the grave unpopularity that he courted by standing by the Americans. So I think we have a story of an enormously popular Prime Minister who lets his authority, or indeed embraces his authority, dribbling away and eventually being replaced in a kind of semi-coup, a kind of soft coup by Gordon Brown, by his great rival, from very slightly to his left. That's just Labour leads while in government as well. And of course, the Blair leads are much, much higher, much, much stronger than Labour in power at other times. So we've got a strange story I think I want to unpick to begin with today, and then we'll have, I hope, lots of discussion, which is how do you achieve such enormous heights of popularity, which at one point in the autumn, winter of 97, 98 were up in the 80s%, and then how does it all come crashing down? However, having lasted so long, so many years into your time in office. Well, one answer, I think, is that Blair had a strategy and he had an answer for the governing problems of his time. Now, you didn't have to like that view, or you didn't have to agree with that view, and often, I suppose, because unfortunately I'm extremely old, I can remember most of this, you didn't have to necessarily agree with it at the time to see that there was a thrust to the policy. And the thrust of the policy was globalisation is happening, economic, social, intellectual, and it's going to be the great wave of that time. Now, in our more war-ridden and autarkic times, full of sanctions and full of leaping or crashing oil and gas prices, that looks like less of an insight. But at the time, globalisation was something that Blair said, you might as well say that you don't want autumn to happen, or you might as well say that you don't want the tide to come in. Globalisation is happening, you have to adjust to it, you have to account for it, and you have to be able to deal with it. So therefore, what is the great answer to globalisation, which is going to destabilise jobs, which is going to destabilise communities, which is going to lead to much more rapid change? One of the answers is education. One of the answers is that especially secondary education and higher education should be much better resourced and should include everybody. That there should be, in the famous idea of the time, no child left behind, no pupil left behind, no tolerance for failure, in the words of the Cabinet Office and its policy and delivery units. Because Blair has, I think, what's more obvious these days as he gets older, and as he gets older like we all do, he becomes more like himself. He becomes more like a kind of painting of himself, and his attitudes become stronger and stronger and more flavourful. He'd always had a technological bent. He'd always had a kind of techno idea of what drives change, a strangely Marxist, determinist economic view of why politics happens, which he gets from kind of Marxism today in the late 80s, early 90s. Because he'd said another way of reacting to globalisation is that Britain, as it did in the 80s, has to technologically innovate. When Britain became home of the home computer, became home of the car efficiency drive, building much cheaper, much quicker cars in Europe, or whatever it was, became a telecommunications hub, all true. that the government and the public sector had to adjust to that as well. Here, shall we say, there were problems. You know about the problems with the Post Office Horizon system, which can only be described as a catastrophic disaster. But the e-university that turns into a disastrous fraud case, the NHS choose and book system, which is supposed to help you with your GP choose between hospitals to be referred to, only comes into being in very shadowy form. ID cards, of course, which we now talk about again, never happen because of political and ideological discontent with them and opposition. Tax credits, which we can maybe say a bit about in discussion, they do work, and they work quite well, but they struggle to keep up with, of course, the very quickly shifting income or wages of people who are naturally on the margins of the labour force. So you're always in a situation when you're a low earner, either having to pay back tax credits or claiming tax credits, and you're never quite sure where you stand, which is a massive problem when you don't have a huge amount of income. So the first answer was education to globalisation. The second answer was technology, and it's still Blair's answer to technology. It's simply that AI is now the Tony Blair Institute's answer to our many, many problems. And as I say, he's always been like that. In one of his speeches in opposition as Labour leader, he proudly announced a deal with BT at the time to link up every school to the internet, which sounded thrilling and science fiction-y at the time, now sounds very accepted, very boring. So it's always been there in his thinking, and was less successful, I think, as the book argues, although other books are available, it was less successful than the education drive, I think. Other successes, I think, are due to the famous combination of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who often fell out famously, spectacularly, fell out with great rows and arguments. But as Blair said to me when I interviewed him for the book, actually that gave them a lot of strength because you could have these issues out, and pretty much, although he didn't say this, Brown was unsackable except for just after the 2001 election, so you just had to have it out with him. That gave Brown enormous power over the domestic sphere, and it created a kind of Beatles effect of Paul and John using both of their particular skills and their particular views to actually make the music in that comparison. Kind of Gordon Brown as deep-lying sweeper that Harold Wilson called himself, and Tony Blair as political striker, if you will. But that gave Gordon Brown total power over economic policy and enormous power over domestic policy. What was his view? His view, just like Rachel Reeves, I think, is that you must privilege security and stability to inculcate higher productivity and higher growth. And you must also invest in infrastructure and in soft infrastructure, e.g. training, to improve and increase productivity. Very much Rachel Reeves' economic policy is in the shadow of Brown and is a kind of Brown 2.0 and has the pluses and minuses of the Brown economic policy, which is to restrain consumption and bid up investment. That actually had big effects at the turn of the century. You can see the UK line, which is just a flat line in the middle. Productivity rises faster than others and overtakes Italy. Well, that's not such a fantastic feat, perhaps, but it begins to approach the productivity of the leaders. The United States, it goes up quicker than that of the United States for some of this, and it goes up, nearly as fast as some of the other leaders like Canada, and it begins to approach some of the other states. So productivity in this period, when Britain has had a productivity problem throughout the post-war era, and also has a big productivity problem now for lots of reasons, we would kill for that rate of productivity increase. Now, not only that, but in the Brown analysis and backing the Brown analysis, I've got lots of whizzy charts that I won't show you on this one because they're too dull, but that growth of productivity comes from inside companies. It doesn't come from new entrants and disruptive destruction of old companies by new companies. It comes from inside bigger and medium-sized institutions, which means that stability, including independence for the Bank of England, generally lower interest rates than they would have been otherwise, and also a sense of forward security of public spending, because now we get 3 to 5 year plans of public spending. It does something to British capitalism, which chaos, Brexit and austerity does not help with. But that isn't much of an insight in some ways, is it? Unemployment is low. And this is one of the Labourisms, I call them, of the New Labour period, of the Blair and Brown period, which we often absorb, like voters today, don't think about, and then move on to the problems. Yes, this was a period of rapid globalisation, very fast, rapid growth, especially in the United States, and that was dragging Britain with it. But there were plenty of what Scandinavians would call active labour market measures, like the New Deal for young people, like training schemes, like increased use of regional policy, that were helping that line to go down even faster than it would have done otherwise. Labour come in, unemployment 6 or 7%, they take it down all the way to between 4 and 5%, which is pretty much what Keynes would have defined as the full employment measure, so that the only unemployment left is frictional unemployment of people moving between jobs, or structural unemployment of people who can't find jobs. For instance, there's not the right match to their skills in their region, or there's not enough demand in their region. But this is pretty much as low as you can possibly go in capitalism without using much more physical controls, without using much more strong measures of intervention. So that's the third answer to globalisation, is giving people security, providing people with jobs, using tax credits and a minimum wage to raise wages. A fourth answer, however, is not Labourist, is certainly not liberal, and I think is new to the Labour family of ideas. And that's the idea of communitarianism. Blair, as a genuinely religious person and thinker, and of course throughout his period as Prime Minister, a closet Roman Catholic, is deeply indebted to Catholic social teaching, to communitarianism, to the idea that we are all, as he puts it in one of the conference speeches, we are all members one of another, and that we are all part of an organic single whole, which is a community which deserves respect throughout its space and deserves warm personal links between individuals and groups, not the atomised cold individuals of what he would have seen as the liberal Thatcherite revelation, to put it in those religious terms. He is indebted to many relatively small c conservative communitarian thinkers like Amitai Etzioni here, to talk about society as a series of horizontal links between different institutions, between different parts of civil society, like local government and schools and the churches and charities, and not that the state will provide from the top, that the state will be a hub in the middle in a horizontal manner, in an equal manner with other institutions. Now again, one might like that idea, one might not like that idea, but it is a very powerful idea that Blair brings to the Labour family, which has been there, but he puts more emphasis behind. And this explains why we get beacon schools with other schools clustered around them. This explains why we get neighbourhood hubs. This explains why we bring charities into policy on homelessness or rough sleeping. This explains all of these policy initiatives, which are part of mobilising society, rather than, as David Cameron would have said, mobilising the state. So let's just look at one set of policies. I just want to look at one set of policies as a success, and to show you the last answer to globalisation. We've had education, we've had the techno fix, we've had the idea of community, which Labour has tried to regenerate in quite a microwavable form via New Labour in the last 18 months to 2 years with not very much success. Well, let's look at actual hard policy, because I think this is where I've been able to bring something as a public policy writer, and I think this is somewhere where people feel and people see success. So I've talked about what some of the American writers under Biden called the emotional heft of politics, which is what Biden doesn't really succeed in getting, and the Democrats, of course, are defeated in 2024. But he does have what the Biden team called deliveromics or deliverology. The National Health Service gets in this period the only large and sustained wave of funding that it ever gets without huge up and down, governed by the budget, which of course is one of the problems with Keynesian demand management, which is that one year you might spend more on health because the economy's down, or you might spend less. The Brown dispensation, which is to go 3 to 5 years ahead on public spending and to have comprehensive spending reviews, gives the NHS for the first time in its history a tsunami of money, by which I mean not just the initial peak, which we've seen before even under Thatcher in the mid-80s, but it gives it that sustained push behind the first peak, which is the important follow-through, which is the key. Have a look at that. 6% real terms spending increases under Blair and Brown, which is pretty much what I think you need it to do to actually gain. Pretty much policy experts reckon this is more like a steady state. This is not improvement because everything's becoming more expensive, interventions, drugs, keeping people alive, people living longer. It's always getting more expensive in real terms. 4% is probably a steady state. 6% is enough to make the NHS actively, actually, noticeably better and much better. Have a look at waiting times. This is 13 weeks and 26 weeks waiting in England. 500,000 people, no people. Like the NHS before the Blair-Brown reforms and money, and after the Blair-Brown reforms and money, are like night and day. And damagingly to my mental health, in the archive, in the National Archives papers about this, there is discussion amongst ministers and officials in the early Brown period about abolishing NHS waiting lists altogether, and you being able to see a consultant next day, day after that. So this is a complete transformation of what the NHS had been known as, which is an egalitarian but a queuing system, into a system with very little queuing, and in terms of cancer specialism, almost no queuing, because cancer gets a specialised cancer pathway, as those of you who have had cancer or your relatives have had cancer, like my mother in the last few years. The cancer part of the NHS is still functioning quite well, even as other bits are deeply, deeply malfunctioning. And more than 3 months of waiting, painful with your hernia or your endometriosis or whatever it is, 500,000, and then down to just 80,000 7 years later. This is the only sustained period of NHS improvement that England and Wales have ever known, and of course may indeed in my working life ever know now. And gradually, that gets noticed by voters. Takes a very long time for net satisfaction to rise, of course, because there's a lag. Most of us never experience the NHS. Maybe we go to the GP once or twice a year, or we have a hospital appointment, but very few of us are very, very sick, especially in our middle age. And so therefore it takes a long time for experiences of the NHS to filter into people's consciousness. It also takes a long time for the general NHS to be seen as good as your local NHS. And it takes a long time for very, very satisfied to rise. Because of course, who's very satisfied with anything? And there's always something wrong with everything under consumerisation. Next example, pensioner poverty. Post-war Britain was a place, despite anti-boomer rhetoric today, saying, oh, the boomers have had everything, the boomers have got everything. Well, post-war Britain was a place of pensioner poverty, which helps explain why it's very difficult for Rachel Reeves to abolish winter fuel payments, because everybody imagines their granny alone with the 3-bar fire, which is very expensive to use and basically has only got a state pension. Well, under Labour, for various reasons, partly, of course, because defined benefit pensions come due, and lots of people who've had professional jobs in the post-war retire. Of course, that pushes pensioner poverty down, but so does pension credit, and so does higher state pensions, which begin the long, long fall of this number, and now all the way down to under 10%, which is an extraordinary success of British public policy, from 40% down to under 1 in 10 today. We talk a lot over the time about our failures, our difficulties, our slowness. These are triumphs. New Labour, through working tax credits and working family tax credits, and also through child benefit, halves child poverty that Labour has never been able to do before. One of the surprises, if you read the book, take it out of a library, don't need to buy it. One of the surprises of this is that this is a far more redistributive government than the Attlee and Wilson governments. Even put together, in cash terms and in GDP terms, which is a revelation which is very surprising to us, knowing about Blair as a centrist and thinking about Blair as pro-American or thinking about the left opposition to him, all perfectly legitimate. But equally, there is a more nuanced and a more balanced story to be told about the Blair era, which sees child poverty and pensioner poverty crashing down. But of course, the left-wing critique is also right. That's a terrible academic answer for you, a terrible academic kind of both-siderism here, which is that although poverty falls, and Blair says there will never be any rest, there will never be any vanity while one child is in poverty, and sets an extraordinary ambition in the Roundtree speech of 2001 that the Labour government will abolish child poverty. Imagine that today, someone saying they're going to abolish child poverty. How ambitious that would sound. And Blair just says it and everyone says, oh, okay. Well, the flip side of that, for left-wing people, for the Milibandites and Corbynites who take over the Labour Party after Tony Blair, is that he doesn't focus on equality. Even Labour revisionists like Tony Crossland in the post-war period, who'd said, well, we don't need to nationalise everything, we don't need to tax the rich up to 90%, that's ridiculous, we need to have a dynamic private sector economy, for instance, Crossland had said, all these things. Even they'd said that equality should be Labour's touchstone and guiding star. Now, overall, Blair did not believe that. He was in, I'm afraid I'm going to use the words Peter Mandelson here, Peter Mandelson said, we're very comfortable with people getting filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. Well, what that meant is that the fierce powers of globalisation, which were making the very rich even richer, because they could invest anywhere, they could go to labour anywhere, they could get a yield anywhere. Well, they were being dragged back by high taxes, and the bottommost 10% were being pushed up by tax credits and by minimum wage and all these other measures. But equally, those effects were countering each other. This was called by The Economist running up the down escalator. So the world was becoming more unequal and Labour was running faster and faster and faster to help working people, but that just kept inequality stable. Although it's worth saying that the explosion of inequality under Thatcher is not replicated under Major and Blair. And indeed, again, we've seen some measure of fall of inequality in the last decade or so. So, not an unalloyed story, but Blair didn't care so much about inequality, he cared about poverty and destroying poverty, something Labour had always cared about, but he didn't care about some of the other Labour family views. That said, who pays for all these tax credits? Who pays for much better public services, as I've shown in the NHS? Who pays for better infrastructure? For instance, the book doesn't address transport, but transport, for instance, local bus services get gradually better. Rural bus services is something I've taken a look at with another hat on about walking in the countryside. Who pays for all that? Very, very clear from the IFS analysis that it's the richest. Isn't it strange? Tony Blair, the centrist Tony Blair, opposed by the left of his party, by far the most redistributive Prime Minister of the past few decades. Richest, 10% worse off through tax and benefit changes, poorest, 13, 14% better off. It's the middle term that does that. It's 2001 to 2005 that does that. You'll see term 2 there is the best for those people. That's partly because we get the Brownite tax credits essentially topping up your income if you're on a low income. The quintessential person to gain from New Labour in office probably is a woman, probably works part-time, probably works in a supermarket, probably doesn't work in a huge city that's expensive. So there you go. There's a way of knitting together the way Liberal Labour and Blue Labour see the world, which is a kind of Biden deliverology view of the world, which is maybe just make people's lives a lot better. That's very, very strange, that story, because Blair, he doesn't reduce inequality, but he does reduce poverty by a lot. Blair, he doesn't believe in nationalising things, indeed he privatises certain remaining elements of both the British public services and what remains of its kind of private sector economy offer. On the other hand, many elements of the state roll forward into charities or the third sector or the civic society. And I think the reason for this strangeness, what I call this Janus face of the Labour Party looking both left and right in this period, looking to the future, which probably he thinks of as a more liberal, progressive socialism, but also to Labour's past, is about the melange or mosaic or mix, this huge kind of blancmange he's made of Labour ideas. Partly from the SDP of the early 80s, who said, doesn't matter how you do it, it matters the end point, was one of the SDP's big arguments. It was very, very popular with middle-class, middle-aged public sector professionals, for instance, their big constituency. Blair captures the SDP vote. But he brings with it, via the work of the LSE sociologist Anthony Giddens, he brings with it an argument that's full of this idea of networks, full of the idea that society, as I showed with that slide about Etzioni, is a cobweb of centres of power that are not above or below each other, but are connected to each other in some form of semi-mystical, national, semi-intellectual, semi-feeling connection. So I'm even struggling for the words to find how to kind of express it. But certainly in a national community that doesn't involve the state doing everything for you, but it does involve you being in what I call a non-contractual, non-legal community relationship with other people. It's a bit like that muscular liberalism of John Kennedy in the early 60s that asks what you will do for your country. So we get image upon image, a kaleidoscopic politics for a very complicated age that is becoming broken up, becoming balkanised. It isn't simple, isn't a simple matter of left and right. We get abolition of prison sentences under a year, but if you commit a really serious crime, you could go away for a minimum life tariff. So Labour looks left, Labour looks right. We get privatisation of air traffic control, but we get nationalisation of a lot of family life. We get homework contracts. We get ASBOs with parents, holding you as a parent to account for the actions of your children, which is a very non-liberal way of seeing the world, very non-individualistic way of seeing the world. Again, looks left, looks right, looks to the future, looks to the past. We get a huge amount of increased state action, but we don't get more equality. We get a standardised third sector, for instance, as I say, homeless charities, that, on the other hand, has to do as it's told if it wants the state money from the lottery funding or from the Department of Local Government. So to conclude, you'll be enormously glad to hear, to conclude, I think a little bit like the new Liberal government of the Edwardian period was a culmination of many liberalisms, many promises that the Liberals had made for a long time, for instance, national insurance, better pensions, labour exchanges and the like. This Labour government was a culmination of Labourism, which in some senses pays off Labour's debts to a right to roam, to devolution in Scotland and Wales, which the Liberals had promised for more than 100 years, to a national minimum wage, to compulsory trade union recognition, or your right to have your union rep with you when you meet your employers. All of these Labourist promises that Wilson and Callaghan had not been able to do, Labour does deliver in this period. So this is a kind of culmination of that Labour socialist or social democratic ideology. But like the new Liberals in the Edwardian period, having done that, you feel exhausted, having honoured John Smith's legacy, who was Labour leader in the mid-90s, and having honoured the Wilson and Callaghan attempt, for instance, to secure devolution for Scotland and Wales. Where do you go then? Well, the answer was you try and equip the country for globalisation. You try and make it better educated, more able to deal with technology. You try to make sure that no child leaves school with no GCSEs at A to C. You try to say that communities should be connected not just in terms of feeling, but in terms of bus links, cycle lanes, train links. You try to say that the future is very, very challenging, which it is and has got much more challenging since Blair's era, but that the state can help you, not answer for you, not work for you, but help you and support you. In Bill Clinton's terms, who's very influential on New Labour, this is a hand up, not a hand out. Now, whatever we think about that in terms of all the measures adopted, that was an enormously successful political collage for a very, very long time, when this Labour government's collage seems to have fallen apart very, very quickly. So we have to ask ourselves why that is. Is that a measure of political skill? Is that a measure of the width of these ideas, covering the waterfront to such an extent that Blair even has to invent a Potemkin opposition in the Treasury in Gordon Brown and his advisors? Or is it that Blair rode a certain moment of growth, of globalisation, of optimism, of literally a younger country? Well, I'm not sure about that. I don't actually know, despite having written hundreds of pages about it, and I'd be glad to hear what you think about it, and I'm also looking forward to discussing this with Jim. So I'll end there, and then we can have, I hope, what's a great discussion. Thank you.
Sorry for the long walk. I thought better than to walk round and jump up. That'd be more embarrassing.
That had disaster written all over it.
That did have disaster written all over it. So yeah, I forgot to say at the start, I'm Jim Cooper. That's who I am. I've got lots of questions, Glenn, but I'm also conscious I don't want to monopolise everyone's time, so everyone else got questions too. So the first one is that obviously you're doing contemporary history, and I do a bit of contemporary history, I teach contemporary history as well. So what then are like the challenges of doing contemporary history? Because when you obviously there's to be more sources in the future which may change what you think. So are you making any kind of inferences about sources, or are there any kind of sources which you think you couldn't get to, you couldn't access? Now we've got diaries and stuff like that, but beyond like the official record, so what kind of challenges and inferences you're having to make about when doing contemporary history?
How long have you got? I think that number one is you've already touched on this, the deluge of information that you've got. You've got government websites that are stored at National Archives, so the government websites from this period are all there. You've got this huge deluge of papers coming out of the National Archives. You can interview people because they're mostly still alive, etc., etc. And you've got this huge amount of journalism on it, whatever it is. And it just, I hope I've been pretty humble in the book and talking about this as just a reconnaissance. It's just a feeling for the landscape, because people are going to write about this, especially, as I mentioned, about foreign policy, Northern Ireland, devolution. There's so many books in here. It's actually fantastic. It's actually exciting, isn't it? Because we can go out into a huge undiscovered country and think about, well, actually what was going on. So you can turn that round into a kind of opportunity. But number one, it's just deluge of sources. Number two is that, I'm looking out here as well, and us as well, you can remember it all happening, most of it. So you've got your own personal memory, you've got your own personal connection to those ideas and what was happening in your life at the time. And also you're dealing with politics in real time now, especially under another Labour government. So you are all the time in a discourse with yourself about your own memories and about your own reaction. And so when I was writing it, I was always trying to be surprising and not just be a man who is slightly more left-wing than Blair writes about Blair, because that would be intensely boring, I think. So you're just trying to give a surprise on every few pages, something counterintuitive. So we all remember where we were when Tony Blair talked about Princess Diana and how you reacted to that. So that's, and whether he made an emotional connection with you or not. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it. I think the third thing, and I touched on this again in the talk, is this challenge to your mental health, where you're looking at policies just surging forward. So you're looking at, London Challenge in London schools. London schools in the 80s had all sorts of tremendous, tremendous problems, which we don't have time to go into. But people were literally fleeing London to go to schools in Hertfordshire or Surrey or whatever. And now we get people battering on the door to get into London, to go to London schools. So you're just looking at, I accept in particular fields, just vast success. And we're at a time now where we feel much less hopeful, I think, is the national mood. I think YouGov's got like 65% things will get worse next year. So that's a real challenge. I've written about this in Political Quarterly, which is 5 problems of contemporary history. It was going to be 6, but the editors didn't want 6, so it had to just be 5. I'll content myself with 3 there. Yeah,
well, it's on a reading list from one of the modules that we're doing that article.
Oh, okay, so, yeah. Fine, that's fine.
But also the thing about remembering things is that I remember that the protests against the Iraq War, And but Blair still wins, despite all the millions of people sent out to march.
Yeah.
So what impact then does the Iraq War actually have on the 2005 general election? Why didn't we have a Lib Dem government, for example? But also, it's interesting how things change, where I remember Brown's kind of rolled out, isn't he, in the election, with the ice cream cones. So like basically, we need Brown to be front and centre to reassure the voters. And of course, 5 years later, Brown's kicked out. So how important really ultimately was Iraq as a domestic political issue in 2005?
I think that Iraq is key to knocking off the lustre, the golden kind of ready Brett glow that Blair had as a kind of Reagan, unbeatable Teflon politician. I mean, he drove the Conservatives absolutely around the bend because they just couldn't touch him. He's just like a superhero who'd move quicker than the punch. They just could not land a blow on him for years. And we see that in the numbers. And suddenly he becomes more leaden, more difficult. He becomes an earthly politician, really, a normal politician. And the numbers become normal for a government after a few years. It's not particularly vastly unpopular, but it is unpopular. And for the first time, Michael Howard's Conservatives sort of move up to within contention. There's lots of things going on there, of course, and the mention of Michael Howard is hopefully helpful because the Conservatives start to get their act together. Because under Haig, slightly unfairly, he's very, very undercooked at the time, and especially under Ian Duncan Smith, they basically feel like a bit of a national joke, the Conservatives. So in fact, they can't touch Blair. He just keeps punching them. And he says, the 2001 election, Alistair Campbell says, it's like machine gunning a corpse. Their majority is at over 170, and he's disappointed. He's like, well, why did they win any seats? Because, partly Campbell is just driven by blind hatred of the Tories. It's kind of so tribal and primal. So, yes, it's true that they win the 2005 general election, but they lose 50, 60 seats, some to Lib Dems, mostly 40 or so to the Conservatives. So it knocks off the lustre. The interesting thing at this point is that Gordon Brown is seen as the kind of leaven to Blair's perhaps showman-style PR man slickness. Brown is seen as the guy in the engine room or down the shed making all the things. Famously, when focus groups are asked, they say he's like a big old Volvo, like a big old battered Volvo, like it just keeps going forever, just can't stop it. Although it might not be very flash, and there's that poster they never use, not flash, just Gordon. Probably the best political poster ever made that was never got used. So he's got this image, and I mentioned that kind of John and Paul thing. He's the John, isn't he? He's the kind of man who makes the engine room work, and therefore they've got the whole thing sewn up. Brown is in his cave. He's totally finished with Blair, who he says has lied to him about the succession. He's gone back on the pact. We'll never know the truth of that. But he does come in because he thinks, Labour might lose its majority here in 2005. And he comes back and he basically is so powerful towards the end of that campaign. But remember, why isn't there a Lib Dem government? Lib Dem's getting over 23%. They win over 60 seats. This is incredible for them. Had they had a bit, Charlie Kennedy at that time was having loads of difficulties. Had they had a leader who was a bit more present, they probably would have won 80 or 90 seats like they might do next time. So anyway, long tedious answer, but it brings him down to earth, to a place where the Brownites can corner him over the Israeli war in Lebanon and they can push him out. Nothing ever really changes. Labour leader unpopular about the Middle East. It's a kind of running theme.
Yeah. I think one more question before I open it opposite on that idea of then the Tories getting their act together. 2005, obviously they get David Cameron. And of course, Cameron, is quoted or claimed as misquoted saying he's the heir to Blair. So in some ways, you could argue that if you didn't have Ronald Reagan, you wouldn't have had Bill Clinton. If you didn't have Margaret Thatcher, you wouldn't have had Tony Blair. There's the action and reaction. And obviously, Cameron is trying to reposition himself as some sort of accepting of the new Labour settlement, at least in terms of style, if not of substance. So if perhaps in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, where perhaps our generation grew up in Thatcher's Britain, and what's been the legacy of Blair in terms of the Conservative Party, the Labour Party? Could you say we're now living in Blair's Britain, just like perhaps for a long time we were living in Thatcher's Britain? Does that make sense? And then what went wrong with Cameron? Was it just the financial crisis, or was it always going to be style more than substance in terms of the new Labour settlement?
We've got a very long set of answers coming to that one as well, but I'll try not to do that. to some extent, we are living in Blair's Britain, because a bit like Thatcher living off Wilson's public sector and all of those health centres that Wilson had built, all those hospitals from the Conservative hospital plan that Wilson had built, Thatcher lived off the fat of that while able to cut, while the NHS did roll on mostly. And we've been living in Blair's Britain with school buildings, hospital buildings, public sector infrastructure, public sector people in the public sector and semi-public sector like ourselves who were trained at the Blair period, who had got PhDs in academia in the Blair period. We've been living off that for some time, and it's only when austerity goes on for quite a long time, to a certain extent May and Johnson break with austerity quantitatively, but when it goes on for a long time that you run down your store of that. Number one, so we're living with the public sector that Blair built. Number two, I think in real intellectual sense, the thing that Cameron took from him and where Blair did affect the mood and the tone is the extreme social liberalism of Britain. Britain is a big outlier, not that you'd know it, on attitudes to immigration, attitudes to gender and sex, attitudes to age and liberalisation, all these social issues that most European countries are much more conservative about. And you'll hear things said in the Mediterranean in countries that you might never hear in an extremely socially liberal country like Britain. And it's partly, although he's pushing with the grain, as with many areas, it's partly Blair that does that. Because he says himself, he's quite socially conservative, but that's not for him to say. And that's a very powerful lesson to David Cameron, who of course pushes that social liberalism further. The reason why David Cameron doesn't succeed as much is, I think, again, quite complicated. But it's, number one, his revolution in his party is never achieved. So his party remains socially conservative. And so for gay marriage, a lot of the votes on that are from the opposite benches. Number one. Number two, of course, as you say, the economy is much more difficult and you can't spend money. But Cameron has it in his hands to effect a kind of more socially liberal revolution, because he could have chosen to campaign for the alternative vote and had a ticket election with the Liberal Democrats where there was coalition Liberal Democrats and coalition Conservatives who stood for election in 2015. He chose to drop what could have been a kind of Baldwinite Liberal Conservative settlement, which is what Blair would have done, and go for placating the Faragists to his right, which most leaders have done ever since, and which, I would argue is a total disaster, because there is no end, there's no trench at which that giving in will finish. Mm-hmm. So you begin as David Cameron saying, we'll have a referendum on Europe to buy you off in the 2015 election, and in the end you get to the stage where your party is saying, we'll remove indefinite leave to remain from people who are already here, and we'll pull out of the Refugee Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights. So where the hell have you got to go after that if you're supposed to be a right-of-centre Conservative party? Nowhere. Yeah. So, you're going to end up to the right of the RN in France by some way. Yeah. So basically Cameron drops the ball where a politician who feels the rising tide of where he is intuitively would not have done that.
It sounds like he just wasn't as good at politics as Blair, so I think Cameron was a bit of a chancer.
Well,
I think he was going to, 2015 he wasn't going to win outright. He could maybe have another coalition, go back to the Tory right and say, I'm sorry guys, a referendum's not going to happen because we've got to stay in power of the coalition.
Well, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
I mean, I often describe David Cameron as like a Blair mini-me or a microwave for Blair, because he's a kind of Blair tribute act, which he would have been better off in an age of enormous inauthenticity. What I always say to people is just be yourself. Just be yourself. And the fact is, he's basically a guy from a very comfortable background who thinks he'd be quite good at it. Yeah. So why not say that? Yeah. Which he does, but he doesn't. He tries to give it an intellectual weight with Big Society from Philip Blond and Red Toryism, where he'd been better off going with liberal Toryism. I mean, he could have governed with Clegg if they'd stood down for each other forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
If only we ran the world.
If only. Okay, I'm going to have to shut myself up, otherwise I will carry on. So we have a mic. We have a roving mic. So show your hand if you want to ask a question, and we'll get the microphone to you over
let the recriminations begin.
Good.
I'm kidding. Well, I'm only partially kidding.
We
actually.
welcome the kicking. It's like masochism strategy.
I did want to push you a little bit more on Iraq, but then I had a question about contemporary history. So, everyone talks about remembering 1997. I was 9 in 1997, but I was 16 in 2003, right? And so my overwhelming experience of the Labour government was protesting against the Iraq war and the unbelievably gutting, horrendous realization that this was going to happen anyway, and the deep, profound trauma of that event, right? And so I would say that it is really difficult, partly for that reason. I think that the numbers of dead in Iraq probably morally outweigh, let's say, and you're going to get asked, I'm sure you have an answer to this, but, morally outweigh a 6% increase in funding for the NHS, right? It's just like, there is no moral balance sheet that can offset that. But I will say this, clearly Blair is very enervating for me, right? And I think for a lot of people in this room, and I think you yourself have a very different relationship with Blair. My argument, perhaps, is that this may not actually be contemporary history, right? I think that the things that enable the political ecology and the sort of economic and geopolitical landscape that enabled Blair and which Blair swam in has been profoundly left behind, right? It was unmade by the 2008 crisis. The geopolitical landscape has been completely reworked by Trump, among many, many other things. We no longer live in an age of say, human rights, right? That the sort of Sam Moyne human rights last utopia moment has been undone by Gaza, among many other things, right? And then also the massive pressing issue of climate change, energy scarcity. Things like this mean that we live in a world that is qualitatively different to the 90s. And 1997 was a long time ago. Writing about 1997 now is kind of like writing about World War II in 1977, right? It is genuine history now. And so I would say that one of the things, even though we both find Blair quite enervating, our relationship to him as a historical object might be within a set of systems that are now closed and are gone forever. It might be looking at a corpse rather than thinking about all of us in a constant flow of history for which Tony Blair is still a part of. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and I'll take that in two parts. And the first is, I think what you're hinting at in your first remarks there is a generational difference between us, because instead, rather than being 9 in 1997, I was 22, right? So you get that experience of, oh, thank God, there's a government at least that has a strong view of the public sector, must be vigorous and must be, functional. Whereas the major period in particular had seen it run down to really appalling levels where, Blair says, you've got whole floors of schools falling in, etc. And people are just like, the water's coming in, literally. So there's a generational difference there. Well, I'm sorry, that's the clasp. That is the clasp set of building techniques which I've written about. I apologise for that as well. The second thing is that I don't think there's any way in which I agree with this, that you can set the foreign policy calculus, remember that there's a lot more foreign policy there as well, like Kosovo and Sierra Leone, against the domestic policy calculus, because I think they're just in such different registers that one of the reasons that I've only tackled domestic policy in the book, partly, of course, it's because that's what I write about. And I hope there'll be a foreign policy companion piece as well, so there'll be someone else to write the foreign policy equivalent, is that I just think it would be really, really hard. It would also take much, much longer to try and place those together. So if you remember the Manchester University Press series on the Wilson government, it's 3 volumes. It's economic policy, cultural policy, foreign policy. So it may be that it is just such an avalanche of activity, and of course the new Labour in office was just incredibly hyperactive on almost every front, that it can't be tackled by kind of the one-person industries that we are. However, I acknowledge that is a problem. That is a problem because the foreign policy aspect, like I mentioned, learning from the New Democrats, or the investment strategy of the European Union, or of course migration and asylum, they are all key parts as well of the domestic arena, and they can't be hermetically sealed off from each other.
Without trial, the London bombings,
Yeah.
the consequences of Iraq war that come home. Right?
Precisely. Yeah.
ID cards,
Yeah.
the extradition of the murder of John Charles Demented. I could go on, but
Yeah,
there's a boomerang effect that this comes into the heart of Britain in a way that means it cannot be hermetically sealed.
Yeah.
Off,
What's interesting here is, for the most part, I think on each of those issues we'd probably agree or get quite near to each other normatively or as citizens. What's interesting here is, as a historian, it's amazing how long all of those issues, which you'd think could be fatal to many governments, take to really puncture through the Blair patina, which is what Jim's already raised. Like, I think Brown nearly wins the 2010 general election, and Blair probably still thinks he would have at least been able to get 20 or 30 more seats. So isn't it incredible, after all those disasters you've just gone through, that voters with rising wages and better public services just think, hey, still good? So I guess that's one of the things I'm trying to get at.
There's a down here next thing.
Thank you. Full disclosure, I'm a Gooner too.
Oh,
Isn't it
commiserations.
incredible? Isn't it incredible how a team that's successful in all 4 competitions is riveted by fear and anxiety?
Like New Labour.
Yeah, I was going to, but I won't go
All
there. Second full disclosure, I worked in Westminster throughout this period. I was in Westminster from 1997 till the second year of the coalition government. And fascinated by what you said. The one thing you said implicitly, I think sometimes, but didn't come through what I felt during that period, was the sheer authoritarianism of it. It was dressed up in lots of ways, all the stunts and all the schemes and all the drawings from various studies and whatever. But it was authoritarian. A lot by young people sounding like Blair, in some cases looking like Blair.
Yeah, working, yeah.
And the relationship, I was in local government, the relationship between the Labour government and Labour local government was absolutely awful.
Yeah.
Blair seemed to base everything, or it was like living in Islington in the 80s and 90s. And if it wasn't for JP, John Prescott, you didn't mention, who actually sorted out a lot of that stuff in practical terms. Things I think could have been very different.
Yeah.
Look what happened in London with running Frank Dobson against Ken Livingstone for the mayoralty. So it was that authoritarian, you do it this way, our way, or it doesn't happen, which worried me throughout that period.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
My view on that is, I think I'd see that as a function of communitarianism, which is government of all sorts and governance more widely provides, but you have to obey. So there is a deep strand of authoritarianism in communitarian thought and in Catholic social teaching, from which also Blair is drawing, which is that we want this society to be interlinked and to be ordered and to be safe. But of course, all of that is about not just giving you things to make your life better, but also asking of you, and also sometimes determining of you. So that's first point. Ideologically, you're absolutely right. There's an authoritarian stream to this. That comes out in particular threads, and one of them you've mentioned, which is the deep distrust of local government. In the housing chapter, I kind of detail how most council housing was moved into the housing association sphere, because Labour's view from the 70s, New Labour's view from the 70s and 80s was council housing stock's too big, they can't manage it, they don't even know what they've got, it would be better to be broken up into housing associations, into local management. And by the way, there should be tenant choice, which I put up on one of the slides, which is you should get a lot more choice what kind of council flat you got. But the flip side of that, of course, is that you've got less security because there had to be more movement through the council housing stock. So ideologically, you're right. There are particular fields where there are particular justifications, Because that justification of distrusting local government, it doesn't come straight from communitarianist ideology, does it? It comes from these practical explanations. But where I agree with you is there's this whole panoply of practical expectations and explanations, which actually behind them are like, do what you're told, which is, we're making the world better, what are you moaning about? Which is, one of the emotional elements. That said, there is a lot of power in this cabinet, and there's a lot, we were talking about this before most people came in, there's a lot of power and autonomy in that cabinet, like Prescott, who has a whole massive mega ministry in the first parliament, where they've got a huge amount of discretion to do things like attacking homelessness, or like bus routes, which I also mentioned about Prescott, which are much, much more interventionist and are not just about control. The single sphere that's most like this is criminal justice, which is a deeply authoritarian. Prisons get bigger, they don't get as big as they did under the Conservatives, under Howard, probably a bit less authoritarian than him, but prisons still get bigger. You have minimum tariffs for crimes, you've got much more direction under the Sentencing Council. But then again, you see, there are complexities, because the Sentencing Council is supposedly an independent body guided by government. So I guess I'm just agreeing with you, but saying that there are lots of strands to this. Some of them, of course, are more liberal, because what do we get in the criminal justice system? We get a lot more drug and alcohol abuse, and a lot more probation, and a lot more help for people leaving care at the age of 18. And that's again going back to this idea of contract, isn't it? Which is, we help people more. I think I've pretty much satisfied myself they did help people a lot more. But that, in a way, makes you more authoritarian, because it's like, we've done all this, why are you still behaving badly? And of course, that's about lots of other reasons that are much deeper than just, we're going to give you a course of alcohol rehabilitation. Are there more? There was one more, yeah.
Thanks. Glenn, really enjoyed your talk, and the receipts that you brought there I thought were very instructive as well. Your third to last slide talks about inheritances, and I kind of want to think about that as a question from the perspective of 2026. How much was there real thinking in the Blair government about unintended consequences? I know there's one that you're very animated about, the introduction of school fees, of university fees, which have now gone up astronomically. But the other one that I couldn't help thinking about when you mentioned Iraq was some of the other interventions that Blair was really adamant about the whole responsibility to protect, right? Was what Kosovo was at.
Yeah.
In the hands of somebody like Trump, we are where we are in 2026. So the genuine question I have for you is, how many of these policies did they sort of stress test for future unintended consequences? Some of which I think we're pretty clearly seeing today.
Yeah. Well, the answer is the New Labour project has a huge amount of thought behind it, good and bad, that I would say, probably lots of you would say, as much as the Thatcherite revolution. So there's this whole fervour around these think tanks like IPPR, Demos, even Centre for Policy Studies, and in the opposition ranks leading up to 97, which is a more liberal social democracy. Let's just call it that, something, the sort of general sort of thrust of it, which is not about economic intervention, it's often about social intervention. But it doesn't contain something, as you hint at, that I'm a historian of, for my sins, which is unintended consequences. And I'll give you two examples. The first is A&E targets, which is you're not to wait for more than 4 hours. So of course everybody waits for 3 hours, 50 minutes. So there's the targeting systems that New Labour used to dry up, as it saw it, the inefficiencies in the public sector. Yes, they do bring up everybody at GCSE getting a D to getting a C, which is great, right? And actually, it's not all grade inflation. There's a lot of evidence that that's real in terms of standardised testing or international comparisons. But it stops there because you've dried up the easy bit. It's easy to dry up the first bit of child poverty, but then you get right into the hardcore. And after the first half, much, much harder, because it's much deeper poverty for all sorts of intersectional reasons that we know about. Second reason, just Blair was surprised about in the famous question time in the 2005 election. People were shouting at him and complaining to him that you had to phone your GP the same day in the morning to get an appointment that day. And he was like, I didn't know this had happened. And it was because the average time wait for the GP was a metric. So of course they want you to phone up in the morning and they'll get you all in on the day. So you couldn't book an appointment 2 or 3 days ahead, 4 days ahead, 5 days ahead. You had to phone up and get an appointment that day. And Blair was like, I've not heard about this, make a note. You know,
I remember that.
He made a point of, like Sven-Göran Eriksson, I'll make a note of that. So that's another example of unintended consequences that they're both slightly absurdist, but that Labour eases up on the targets after 2002-3, partly because there's more money, but also partly because these unintended consequences begin to emerge. To use your example, the responsibility to protect is that, which is very, very clear in Blair's view of Sierra Leone and Kosovo, where probably British armed forces do save tens to hundreds of thousands of lives, which is that the pat or the easy narrative is the one adopted by the Channel 4 TV documentary, which we've just seen, some of us, which is that Blair gets the wrong lesson from those relatively successful interventions and just thinks you can intervene anywhere and you should intervene everywhere. And of course, you can't intervene everywhere and you shouldn't intervene everywhere because every case is different. And the, to some extent neoliberal, to some extent neoconservative doctrine of responsibility to protect gets him into a quagmire of protect who, protect when, protect where, because state power isn't subject to these covering laws that are completely universal. Tuition fees is another good example, which is, of course, New Labour's tuition fee system is nothing like the tuition fee system now that's pretty much blowing up in all of our faces and the government's face as well. It's a top-up fee, which is only about a quarter of the funding. It's not all of the funding. And there are numbers controls on universities to stop there only being one university in the country called, Bristol, where they can just take all of the students and just grow and grow and grow. And the terms are far easier of repayment. That is very, very different to this tuition fee system, but one might argue, have opened the door to this disastrous tuition fee system, which is far, far more damaging. I was talking to John Denham at an Oxford Brookes event, and he said, well, it's nothing like. That's a system that would work. However, the opponents of all tuition fees have to deal with the situation in Scotland, which doesn't have tuition fees, of course, and the government pays the fees. Scottish universities are going to go bankrupt before English ones, and there's a hard cap on numbers. So many, many more working class Scots can't go to university than can go to university in England, and modern participation is far more prevalent in England than it is in Scotland. So you have to deal with the other side of the argument that in Scotland there's a massively hard cap on numbers, and English universities have been able to expand. Yes, some of them are going to destroy the other ones, the little ones. Why does the biggest university simply not eat all the other universities? Which is pretty much the way it's going now, but the opposite isn't a great system either. A system where 40% of 18-year-olds go to university and it's free at the point of use is much more difficult than 20%. So I guess I don't know the answer. If I knew the answer, you think I'll be writing this? I think some form of graduate contribution is inevitable in a mass system, but it should not be a free-floating fee that incentivises universities to destroy each other in a bloodbath. Right. Call me old-fashioned.
Yeah, put that on a T-shirt, Glenn.
I know, yeah.
Yeah. I've consciously got some wine to drink and also some books to buy and sign. So maybe time for any other questions? One or two other questions?
One more maybe. Yeah, two more. We can take a couple quick ones.
Yeah.
This was quite quick and it's slightly unserious, but you said that you interviewed Tony Blair, and I just wanted to know what you made of him, and if it was very tight on talking about what comes in the book, or whether you got a wider sense, especially like what he's been up to since, and just kind of a sense of him. Yeah, I'm curious about him.
Well, my sense of him was that I met him twice to set it up and then had an hour because he's quite rationed for security reasons and everything as well, of course. But and I unwisely thought that he would be, in my mind, just a politician, but he was much more briefed and much sharper than I imagined. So I just got eviscerated the first time. So the second time in the interview, I was much better briefed. He's very, very well. I don't want to speak for him, of course, but I found him to be very frustrated by the way things have gone, of course, very restless about it, very angry about it, but also very self-critical. And if you watch that documentary, I think his demeanour gives away what he doesn't say, actually. And he was much more critical when I was talking to him. And, full disclosure, I wrote a pamphlet for the Blair Institute, which led up to this book, which was about New Labour's public sector policies, and which was partly why I was involved with him. And he was way more critical than I would have been of loads of stuff that his government had done. So the way I found him was very restless. As actually putting the policies and politics aside, it's the phenomenon of having prime ministers who are still young. Like, what on earth is Rishi Sunak going to do now? What on earth? David Cameron's just playing tennis. Yeah. When you've still got, you've still got a lot to offer. Maybe not so much in Liz Truss's case. You've still got a lot to offer, and you've got a lot of experience, and you probably thought you were better at it at the end because you were more experienced. But there's just nowhere to go. So Blair, and I think one of the things, of course, that Blair does is he brings his reputation into eclipse by wanting to advise, I'm going to put this really widely and baggily, wanting to advise governments about liberalisation and reform, and he gets himself into trouble with these regimes that are basically Central Asian oil dictatorships. But then he has vested almost all of that money, I think, in TBI, which now advises African governments about democracy. So again, it's complicated. And my relationship with it is complicated. Your relationship with it is complicated. And that's what's so fascinating about it. Anyway.
I wonder how long till Gordon Brown demands his own documentary.
It's probably
It's
probably
When's
happened.
it my turn?
It's probably happened. But he should have it because, this is a key moment of the world economy. And when people laugh, Brown says, I've saved the world. They did save the world. But anyway, yeah.
Okay. One more
There's
question.
one more.
Yeah.
Sorry, I am very conscious. I don't normally keep people away from alcohol, I promise. Can I just ask, one of the things that's been touched upon in a couple of questions is domestic opposition to Blair, and I don't just mean the Conservative Party. What's Blair, if I was being unfavourable, I might say just incredibly lucky that there was no opposition group to oppose New Labour, essentially. You think of the unions under Thatcher, and historically you think Major and the splits in the Conservative Party, you think the Brexit divisions post-2016. Blair sort of overcomes this with appealing to the media and with getting a favourable relationship there. And I just wonder if this plays a role in maybe the long-term planning that Blair's able to orchestrate, and if this is why maybe we're not going to see this long-term planning in the next decade or 2 decades, if you had any reflections on that.
Yes, I think that's a wider phenomenon, which is that our social life as a nation, as a region, and in globalised terms, is much more unstable. 2 months ago, a month ago, you'd have said maybe the British economy's turning the corner, and maybe things would be looking up for a Labour government. It might not be Starmer and Reeves, but things might be looking a bit better. Now you've got an oil and gas price spike that happened in 73 and 79, now seems to happen more regularly. And you've got social media, you've got 24-hour news, you've got much faster developments. There's that. And in 97, the Times runs this cartoon, this skit, which is, Tony Blair, pilot for the foreseeable future, when he's down there, which is because everyone just imagines he's going to be there for 2 terms. And that means you can say, okay, Let's think about the NHS and have the NHS plan under Milburn in 2000. Let's think about how many nurses and doctors we actually need, which is now much more difficult for Wes Streeting, or for whoever's health secretary. He is lucky in that sense. However, as with everything, it's like Gary Player, the more I practice, the luckier I get. You have to make your own luck as well. And he has a lot to offer the left, which, of course, yes, is desperate for office. But round the cabinet table, you've got Claire Short, you've got Robin Cook, you've got Michael Meacher, you've got, quite left-wing, soft left people who he offers a lot to, who he offers, in Meacher's case, a massive amount of environmental re-regulation of the water industry that the left would kill for today and was desperate for. He offers the trade unions, who are quite pro-Blair in the mid-90s in opposition. He offers the trade unions compulsory trade union recognition, the end of the ban at GCHQ, the right to be represented by your rep, the fact that you can get a vote to be unionised in an existing workplace with 40%. A lot of, limited concessions compared to where we were in 79, but still big concessions that they were like manna from heaven, the big unions at the time. He offers the Trade Union Education Fund, which, Angela Rayner would love for money for trade union research and trade union representation and voting, to encourage voting. It's really quite pro-union stuff, especially early on. So, yes, where are they going to go? Peter Mandelson says, we can just be really centrist. But on the other hand, this is still the culmination of Labourism. This is still a huge amount of Labour gains, which Wilson could not get when he starts to look at negative income tax in 1969, which effectively is like working tax credits. When he tries to give the unions representation in the state as well as taking away their rights in place of strife, which the left also don't like. It often strikes me that Harold Wilson took the opposite tack. He stayed out of Vietnam, he criticised the Christmas bombing, he criticised his bombing of the North, he tries to organise a peace deal with the Soviets, left still hate him. So, in a way, this is a structural problem. Keir Starmer's now got the same structural problem. How far do you go with the Americans? And Keir Starmer's problem is worse because he's got Brexit, because he's not got the security of membership of the EU. Blair could have, counterfactual is, Blair says, at the end, I can't do combat operations in Iraq. Of course, we support American aims and objectives, but we're not going to do combat operations. We're integrally intertwined in intelligence and security, but I can't do it. And in fact, the Americans offer him. Rumsfeld says, I know you've got domestic politics, you don't have to do this. And he still does it, partly because he thinks he's taken a decision quite early, I'm going to stick with the Americans, whatever. And it becomes a kind of this masochistic test of how much in control he is and how much he can drive it through, which he can, but only with Conservative votes, and that begins this splintering that we've rightly talked about of his settlement. So I guess that's a long answer of you get luck, but you make luck. Like, would Gordon Brown have been so popular for so long? Would Keir Starmer have been so popular for so long? Probably not. Now, that might be just because you're good at showmanship. It partly is because Blair's good at showmanship. There he is with his mug, not his China cup. There he is with his Ford Galaxy. But Harold Wilson had worn the Ganex Mac, had the pipe, talked about the tin salmon. It's just politics.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, I think we just have to thank Glen again for a great talk and go get some wine.
Thank you. Is that okay?
Brilliant. Good.